show. I'm Wally Taylor. I'm guest hosting for Ed this week, or today anyway, not the whole week. I don't know where Ed is. Maybe he doesn't know either. Our first guest today is Jim Whalen. Jim is the federal public defender for the state of Iowa. Jim's been with the Federal Defender's Office since it started back in, 1994?
1994.
And now, for the last year or so, he's been the head federal defender. And his office takes appointments to represent criminal defendants in federal court. I thought it'd be great to have Jim on the show today because most people don't understand or know what happens in federal court in criminal cases. We have some sense of what happens in state court, but federal court is a different ball game altogether. So, Jim, thanks for being with us.
It's my pleasure, Wally.
First of all, kind of give us some overview of how the federal system differs from the state system we might be familiar with.
Well, probably the single most important difference is that in federal court, we use federal sentencing guidelines. These guidelines went into effect in 1987. They've been amended periodically since then. And up until 2005, the courts believed that the guidelines were mandatory, that they had to follow them. And these guidelines basically factor in things having to do with the commission of the offense, such as the quantity of drugs involved, whether a gun was involved. And they also factor in the defendant's criminal record. And there's basically a grid. So you find where the defendant's criminal history category is, you find where their offense conduct is, and you see where those lines intersect on a grid. It's been described by some as grid lockup. And in 2005, the U.S. Supreme Court, in a landmark case called United States v. Booker, held that the guidelines were no longer mandatory. And through a series of successive decisions, they have decided that the guidelines must still be considered in sentencing. They should be used as the court's starting point for analysis, but they are no longer mandatory. And that was done because of a recognition that having the guidelines be mandatory violated the Sixth Amendment right of defendants to have a jury determine facts that increased their sentence, other than facts having to do with their prior criminal record, which is a big exception. So, a lot of people, I think, believe that there's some mysterious guideline out there that determines whether a case becomes a federal case or not. I'll have clients say, well, I never crossed a state line with those drugs. How can they charge me in federal court? And the reason is that there is a federal statute that gives federal courts jurisdiction over most drug offenses. You could be prosecuted in federal court or state court, or actually even in both courts if the prosecutors wanted to. So typically they will try to identify defendants who they think may be able to lead them to people who are higher up the food chain in a drug case, for example, or they may target defendants who are subject to some really drastic sentencing enhancements under the not only the federal guidelines, but under certain federal statutes which provide for mandatory minimum sentences.
Now, these federal sentencing guidelines came about from what was called the Sentencing Reform Act back in '84. And at the same time, we started the war on drugs with the Drug Abuse Act, and those kind of formed an unholy alliance in a way, didn't they?
Well, they really did, and I was looking at some statistics this morning that really illustrate this. Back in 1980, which was, of course, prior to the enactment of the sentencing guidelines in '87, there were approximately 25,000 inmates in the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. At the end of fiscal year 2012, there were 219,000. Right now, the BOP is at 139% of its capacity. The Bureau of Prisons budget has gone from $3.6 billion in 2000 to $6.6 billion in 2012. And over half of those inmates are in there on drug charges. And the vast majority of them have no history of violence in their criminal records.
And we're hearing now that maybe the war on drugs is being lost. We aren't winning it.
Well, it's funny. In years past, whenever anyone talked about sentencing reform, what that usually meant was sentencing increases. Right now, there seems to be some momentum in Congress and among the public generally for true sentencing reform that would give judges discretion to fashion appropriate sentences for individual defendants. Senator Leahy has introduced a bill which is referred to as a safety valve bill. And the concept of a safety valve was enacted into the guidelines. I can't remember exactly when it was, but basically what the safety valve said was that if you are subject to a mandatory minimum sentence, but you only have one criminal history point or less, which means you're in the lowest criminal history category, if your crime did not involve violence or the use of firearms, and if prior to sentencing you truthfully disclosed to the government the full extent of your involvement in the case, the judge was given the power to give you a 2-level reduction in your guideline sentence, and most importantly, to sentence you below any mandatory minimum. Now, we were grateful for the safety valve when it was first enacted, because it was the first thing we'd seen in a long time that gave any semblance of relief. But in reality, it applied to a very small percentage of clients. Most of our clients have far more than one criminal history point, and it's not really that difficult to have more than one criminal history point. If, for example, you were convicted of driving without a license and placed on probation for a year, and you committed your drug offense during that 1-year period, you'd have one criminal history point for the conviction and another 2 criminal history points for committing it while on probation. So right away, you would have no chance of being considered for the safety valve. Senator Leahy's bill is much broader than that. It does not contain the types of restrictions on criminal history that the current safety valve does, and it would apply, from the language of it, it appears that it would apply to virtually any mandatory minimum sentence. And some of those mandatory minimums are horrendous. And I can just give you, and this is an example from real life. This man had a fairly serious criminal record as a young man, but he'd gone like 20 years without having any arrests or convictions. He'd turned his life around, had gotten married. He was working as a carpet layer. And while working as a carpet layer, he found a bullet, a cartridge, as he was pulling up some carpet. He was in the middle of work. He didn't think anything of it. He stuck it in his pocket, took it home. When he was changing clothes, he took it out of his pocket and put it on the dresser. He and his wife got into an argument. The police were called, and they saw that bullet, and they arrested him for being a felon in possession of a firearm or ammunition. Now, because of his prior criminal record, even though it was very old, this man found himself looking at a 15-year mandatory minimum prison sentence. The judge had no discretion to do anything other than give him at least 15 years in prison.
And it's called the Armed Career Criminal Act, right?
Correct.
And he wasn't an armed career criminal. He simply had a bullet.
He was a carpet
inadvertently
layer.
And had some criminal history several years back.
And that may be an extreme example, but there are many other less extreme examples of extremely harsh sentences that people are facing where nobody really believes they deserve 15 years or 20 years in prison, but the current federal sentencing scheme really binds the discretion of the judges.
Well, telling war stories, I had a young man who was charged with selling crack on the street corner, and in his past he had a possession of drug paraphernalia like a marijuana pipe or something. Then he had possession of personal use marijuana, but under Iowa law, because he had the prior paraphernalia charge, that became what's called an aggravated misdemeanor, which under federal law is a felony, a drug felony. Then he was again charged with a simple possession of marijuana, which was another aggravated misdemeanor or a felony under federal law. He was looking at a mandatory life sentence without parole.
Yeah, that's not an unusual occurrence. And now, in the past, the only way somebody like that could get out from under a sentence of that sort would be if they cooperated.
Right.
And, if they told on their friends and their associates, and if the government found that the information they gave was useful, then the government, in its sole discretion, would have the power to file a motion at sentencing asking the judge to depart or go below the guideline sentence or the mandatory minimum statute. And oftentimes the kinds of clients that we see are so far down the totem pole in the hierarchy of any drug distribution organization that they really don't know very much. They really don't know the kind of information that would get them a substantial reduction in their sentence.
Yeah. Another type of drug defendant that I think people don't probably appreciate is what we call the Smurf.
Yes.
Would you explain that?
Well, a Smurf is someone who goes around and buys pseudoephedrine tablets from pharmacies or Walgreens at the request of a cook, somebody who is actually going to cook the methamphetamine. Typically, these people are paid for their services by being given a small quantity, oftentimes a very small quantity of the results of the cook.
So they're addicts, and they're buying the pseudoephedrine pills for the person who's making the methamphetamine in order to feed their habit, so to speak.
Exactly. They are not driving new cars. They're often just barely one step from being homeless if they're not already homeless, and they usually are hopeless addicts. And under federal law, if somebody like that, like your client who had the prior aggravated misdemeanor type of convictions, if they get convicted of their role in a conspiracy to cook methamphetamine because they were purchasing pseudoephedrine, they could be looking at a 10-year mandatory minimum prison sentence, or perhaps even more, depending on the number of their prior convictions.
Yeah. Another thing that strikes me about the federal criminal law is the concept of relevant conduct.
Yes.
And it seems like that they can sentence someone on the basis of a conduct or alleged conduct they haven't even been convicted of or even charged with.
That's right. I mean, you could have a client who perhaps is charged with delivering less than 5 grams of actual methamphetamine, and if the evidence in the possession of the government shows that in reality he had a lot more than that or distributed a lot more than that, at sentencing they can pile on those additional amounts and increase his guideline sentence. Now, there was recently a decision by the U.S. Supreme Court called the Align decision, which I think raises an obstacle to the government using relevant conduct to increase sentences above a mandatory, to give somebody a mandatory minimum sentence, but they're still allowed to use it for guideline sentencing purposes. And ironically, since our sentencing guidelines tend to be keyed to those mandatory minimums, courtesy of the U.S. Sentencing Commission, oftentimes the guideline sentence is going to be roughly equivalent to the mandatory minimum anyway.
Yeah, and many times the relevant conduct is supplied by these people who are cooperating with the government, and it's what our clients call ghost dope. There's
Right.
there's no real proof of it, just what somebody says.
Yeah, that's a popular misconception that, a client will say, well, they only caught me with X amount. How can they prove these other amounts? Well, they prove it through the testimony of your former friends and associates who have cut their own deals to save themselves from a 10-year mandatory minimum. And, if a judge finds them credible at sentencing by only a preponderance of the evidence, not beyond a reasonable doubt, your sentence can be increased drastically because of the amounts that they say they got from you or sold to you, even though there isn't a shred of physical evidence to show that those drugs were ever in your possession.
Yeah. Another kind of case that often comes up is a person who's on his computer looking at child pornography. And the people we see usually are the ones who are just downloading it and looking at it on the computer. They never, as far as I know, ever really go after the person who produced the child pornography in the first place, because it's too hard to get those people.
No, and a person like that, when you figure up their guideline calculations, they're oftentimes facing a sentence of 20 years or more, because under the sentencing guidelines, which I think were really developed at a time prior to the internet and the extensive use of computers, where people actually had to go to some effort, or exert some effort to purchase child pornography. You'll have enhancements under the guidelines. For example, you get a 2-level enhancement for use of a computer. I have not seen a child pornography case in the last 18 years that did not involve the use of a computer. You get an enhancement based upon the number of images. If you have more than 600 images, you get a 5-level enhancement. Well, it's a function of the ease with which you can access those materials on the computer that results in people possessing thousands of these images. And oftentimes the images are duplicative, but that doesn't matter under the guidelines. Also, if you have somebody who participates in a file sharing program, they can receive an enhancement under the guidelines of another 5 levels for trading or exchanging in exchange for something of value, namely other child pornography. So what you'll have is somebody with typically with no prior criminal record who is suddenly facing a 20-year prison term, or the more devastating types of cases are where you have somebody who's maybe taken a photo of someone with their cell phone, downloaded it, and put it on their computer. They could be charged with producing child pornography, which carries a 10-year mandatory minimum sentence. Now, some of our judges have recognized the harshness of these sentences, and in fact, just last year, the U.S. Sentencing Commission itself came out with a report where they acknowledged that these sentences were overly harsh. And there are some judges who have taken that to heart and are sentencing these people to sentences that I consider more appropriate. But there's an awful lot of judges that still follow the guidelines.
Yeah. And most of these child porn defendants probably need some psychological or psychiatric help more than a 20 years or so in prison.
Well, that's true. And oftentimes we will have those clients evaluated to assess whether they pose a risk to actual children. And it is extremely rare that any of these people pose such a risk. There is a lot of scientific, sociological data out there which really refutes the alleged connection between child pornography and acting out with children. That's just a connection that I think, though that's part of popular myth, it really doesn't exist in real life.
You were talking earlier about some legislation. In 2010, Congress did pass a law, the Fair Sentencing Act, to reduce the disparity between crack and powder cocaine sentences. Can you explain what that was about?
Well, that was about a long struggle on the part of some of the more enlightened judges, defense attorneys, scientists, to correct the disparate treatment of crack defendants from powder cocaine defendants. The crack guidelines were really passed largely in response to the unfortunate death of Len Bias, who was a famous college basketball player drafted by the Boston Celtics who OD'd on crack. And the perception at the time was that this is the most dangerous, deadly drug ever invented, and that our streets were running in blood because of gang violence over the crack trade. So they basically punished the crack offender, I think, what was it, like 500 times more seriously than the powder cocaine offender.
100, yeah.
100.
Who's counting?
Yeah, the typical, the typical crack cocaine offender that we would see in federal court would be African American. The typical powder cocaine offender that we would see would be Caucasian. So there was a racial disparity that was very obvious in these cases. The Sentencing Commission, to their credit, started studying this issue, started actually looking at the scientific evidence, and concluded that this type of a disparity was no longer appropriate. Finally, after numerous tries to rectify this, they did get the bill through Congress, which changed the ratio. It's still a higher ratio for crack cocaine than it is for powder. For example, right now, if you have 280 grams of cocaine base, you're looking at a 10-year mandatory minimum. You would have to have, let's see, what would it be? You'd have to have 5 kilos of coke to be looking at a 10-year mandatory minimum. If you had 500 grams, you'd be looking at a 5-year mandatory minimum. 500 grams of coke would be a 5-year mandatory minimum. 28 grams of crack would still get you the 5-year mandatory minimum. So they have reduced the disparity, but they certainly haven't eliminated it. Now, this is one of the benefits of Booker and some of those successor opinions. Under those opinions, the judges really do have discretion to disagree with the sentencing guidelines on policy grounds, and many of them on their own have decided to treat these equally, but the disparity is still written into the statute. It was a good step forward, but in my opinion, it didn't go far enough.
Yeah, and is there a proposal to even do away with that, a disparity entirely in Congress now, or not?
I'm not sure if there is or not, and even if there is, the chances of passage this year are rather slim. Yeah. There are other priorities there.
Aside from Senator Leahy's bill, are there any other bills pending in Congress that might change the criminal law?
Not that I'm aware of. None that would make a change that would affect a broad number of defendants. Okay.
Some judges still, as you say, follow the guidelines, and I think it's because, in theory, the idea of equal sentences for equal conduct or for the same conduct makes sense.
Right, and uniformity.
And that was the theory, I think, of the guidelines initially, but somehow it got off the track.
Well, I think when the guidelines were originally formulated, there was a real tension between the desire to have individual sentences that fit a particular defendant and the desire to have uniformity. And I think, unfortunately, uniformity won out. And it has become, that was just a mantra of the Sentencing Commission and its supporters in Congress, that, this equalizes disparities. In reality, it didn't do that, because you still had tremendous discretion left with individual prosecutors. And I think the Northern District of Iowa and the Southern District of Iowa were a classic example of that. In the Southern District of Iowa, up until about in the Northern District of Iowa, up until a couple of years ago, if you decided to cooperate and you basically confessed all of your offense conduct to a government agent, that information could still be used against you at your sentencing to increase your sentence or even to charge you with other crimes. Whereas in the Southern District and virtually every other district in the country, that information could not be used. So again, that's just a crystal clear example of how a prosecutorial discretion could impact on that. Another way that there were disparities is that there are vast differences among the districts in terms of how frequently prosecutors file notice that a defendant has prior criminal convictions. And those can, for example, in a drug case, that could increase your mandatory minimum from 5 to 10 years. The Southern District of Iowa and the Northern District of Iowa ranked in the top 4 in the country in terms of the frequency with which prosecutors would file those mandatory minimums. And of course, here they would always say, well, that's policy from the Justice Department. Well, it may have been the policy of the Justice Department, but it was a policy that U.S. attorneys in a great many other districts ignored or tailored to their individual circumstances. Another place where there were so many opportunities for disparity. I mean, for example, if you had a client who wanted to cooperate, and for some reason that client did not get along with the agent who is assigned to debrief him, that agent would not make a very substantial recommendation for a reduction in sentence. So it could turn on things as whimsical as whether a case agent liked your client or felt comfortable with him. It could turn on which district you were charged in or which state you were charged in. So I think disparity or uniformity, I think, was always kind of illusory, but it was a convenient mantra for people to cite to resist real sentencing reform.
And in fact, the decision, even whether to bring the case in federal court or not, is up to the prosecutor's discretion.
Absolutely.
In many cases could be very easily brought in state court.
And It's strange that over the last couple of years, with the change in the U.S. Attorney here in the Southern District, we have seen a difference in charging practices. Part of that is because of his personal philosophy, but part of it is also, I think, because of budget cuts. They are not pursuing, to the extent that they used to, the more street-level crimes. They're concentrating more of their resources on white-collar cases such as mortgage fraud and bank fraud. So, yeah, the individual prosecutor's philosophy can have a lot to do with that.
And speaking of budget cuts, the defense bar has seen some of that too, have we not?
Well, we certainly have. Our office, as of April 1st, I think we had 32 full-time employees. We are now down to 27, I think. No, it's more than that. We're down to 25.
That's in the entire state.
In throughout all of our offices. We also each had 12 days of furloughs. Those are unpaid days. And most recently, the Executive Committee of the Judicial Council of the United States enacted a temporary one-year rate reduction for the Criminal Justice Act panel attorneys such as yourself who agree to take court appointments in federal criminal cases. They cut the hourly rate by $15 from $125 an hour to $110 an hour. The rate was already quite a bit below what most attorneys would obtain for their services in a privately retained case.
And this is the 50th anniversary of Gideon versus Wainwright.
It's
the case where the Supreme Court said that indigent persons have a right to counsel.
Yeah, it is certainly ironic that it seems like for most of the past year, my efforts as the head of our office have been devoted to surviving this crisis. And, Gideon was certainly a landmark decision that firmly entrenched in American jurisprudence the notion that an indigent person has the right to counsel. But that's a rather hollow promise unless there's adequate funding for it.
If you were to talk to somebody on the street and to tell them what you really want them to know about the federal criminal system, what would you tell them?
I think I would tell them that it is much more harsh than they would probably expect, that it is the federal government has enormous power in these cases. They can take years to investigate a case and put a case against you together. And once they bring that case, they're not concerned about how much it costs. They're not concerned about your individual circumstances. They're determined to get a conviction, and most of the time they will. I would tell people that they need to be prepared for a rude awakening if they're brought into a federal court, particularly as opposed to their experiences in state court.
It's amazing how many families, I'm sure you had the same experience, where their sons or daughters or brothers or sisters are brought into federal court on drug charges usually, and they just cannot believe what the person has to go through in being a defendant in federal court.
We see this all the time. We'll have clients, in our Davenport office, we tend to get a lot of clients who are from the Chicago area. And many of them have had multiple arrests and convictions on drug charges. They may involve very small quantities of drugs. And then they're hailed into federal court, and we're trying to explain to them why they're suddenly facing a 20-year mandatory minimum or even a potential maximum sentence of life. And their first reaction is disbelief that this just can't possibly be true because, they've already paid for their prior conduct. And their prior conduct may have only involved a couple of grams. Yeah. Earlier this year, Judge Bennett issued a lengthy decision in a case out of Sioux City where the woman was sentenced or was about to be sentenced as a career offender, which is another enhancement under the guidelines that is particularly harsh. And as it turned out, two of her priors had actually arisen out of the same event, but due to delays in obtaining analysis of the drugs from the state laboratory, they were prosecuted at two different times by two different prosecutors. And under federal law, they constituted 2 separate prior convictions. So instead of facing a sentence of around 5 years in prison, she was facing a sentence, I think, of around 18 or 19 years. And, that's not an atypical example of what we see.
Well, I hope people got a sense of the criminal justice system today. And from Jim Hoyland, the Federal Public Defender. Thanks, Jim, for being here.
It's my pleasure, Wally.
And now we're going to be back we're going to take a break and be back in a few minutes. And I want to thank our sponsors, the Iowa Sierra Club, Physicians for Social Responsibility, the Great March for Climate Action, Gateway Market, Hawk Restaurant, and the Fighting Burrito. We'll be right back.
Studios. This is Webcast One Live.
Drug and alcohol addiction slowly steals a person's identity, tearing away pieces of their life little by little until one day it seems like the hope of a happy future is gone and there's no chance of getting it back. Here at St. Gregory Retreat Centers, we can assure you that there is hope. Our unique approach to recovery begins with the understanding that the dysfunction and damage caused by addiction can be overcome, not just dealt with. Don't let another day go by. Call St. Gregory today.
Well, good morning. This is the 7th of June in the Lord's year 2010, and this is day 1 of webcast1live.com. We will begin with Max World Live with my special guest, Tom Coates. In just a minute, there's Tom. Wait. Howdy. And we will be live for the very first time on Webcast One Live. Someday we're going to look back on this and say, gosh, remember that old day in history? Wonder where Walter Cronkite was. He must have been around hanging there too. But actually, it's the beginning of Webcast One Live. And thank you for listening. Thanks, Rob Spearman, and everybody who's put together this project together. And we're ready to go live now. So thanks for listening to MaxWorldLive.com.
I can't tell you that it's going real well from time to time, but it is going.
I'm Brian Leach, owner and general manager of Service Legends. I brought along a couple of the home comfort heroes.
Hi, I'm Tammy Wells.
I am Nick Wondershide.
I'm administrative manager
I am the senior technician.
from Service Legends.
It seems like every good thing, when you feel it to the bone that it's good, there's a lot of hard work put behind it. I don't think that you can fake it and have it turn out good.
You know, if we seem like, okay, that's just weird, it's just a furnace, why would you believe so deeply in a furnace? It's not just that, you know, we want to show the world that you can have good service.
Yeah, I mean, it's got to be, it's your home.
You know, it's built into our daily trainings, it's built into our culture, that we're going to do whatever it takes to have each client say they love us, period.
That's why we spend all the hours in the training that we do. And if we guarantee it's going to be a good experience for you, or else it's free, what type of work do you think we're going to do?
There is a guarantee.
Temperature selection guarantee, fixed right or it's free guarantee, comfort guarantee, best value guarantee. All of these guarantees hold us accountable to ensuring that we exceed your expectations. And if for whatever reason we'd fail and we can't make it right, we guarantee all of those guarantees with a 100% money back guarantee.
I mean, if you don't think that your technician can fix it right, are you going to say that to a client? No.
You don't have to worry about having a technician come to your house.
We drug test, background check all of our team members. We put safe people in your home. Each and every one of our service techs, 400 hours a year in training.
You tell it the minute they walk in the door. They know what they're doing, they've done their homework, and they actually truly care about what you want.
Because at the end of the day, you're the person that makes sure I have a job.
They're going to be listening. They're going to want to know what your challenges are. Then they're going to come and give you options, and you get to choose.
If I'm there to help and I make it easy and painless, I did my job right that day.
Well, when it comes to your comfort, safety, and your family. You know, you don't necessarily go buy the most expensive, but you get the most bang for your buck.
Oh, it's worth it because there's a lot of people that will find a way to get it to work right now and then leave and then come back, charge you again, and the cycle just repeats itself. So when I'm out there looking at the furnace, I want to find why it failed today. How can we change the part today with something that you're not going to have to worry about? Is it worth changing the part today? I mean, you can put a lot of money into a furnace. I can fix parts all day. There's good job security in that for me, but is it the right thing for you?
I get a lot of the phone calls of after the technicians are there. They're just in awe. They're like, wow, you guys are great. I mean, I don't even know what to say. You guys are great. Everything you did was perfect. It was great.
Keep going though, I like this.
Just give us a try. I'm gonna take all the risk.
I've got the time to make this right. I've got the support to make it right.
Just check us out.
And if you don't see the value in what we do,
I mean, fixed right or it's free or 100% money back.
enough said.
From the RE/MAX Real Estate Concept Studios, this is Webcast One Live.
And we're back for the second part of our show. Our guest in this segment is Mark Edwards. Mark is retired as the Trails Coordinator for the Iowa Department of Natural Resources and a frequent commentator on protecting Iowa's natural heritage. Mark, happy to have you here.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
You know, people, I think, to a great extent, don't think of Iowa as having a natural heritage, or at least not one we can really be proud of, because there are no majestic mountains or beautiful seashores. What would your response be to that sort of attitude?
Well, as we look back in the historical records and we see before the agriculture began in Iowa, and we had the prairie, which is a very unique ecosystem, very complex, much compared to the rainforest in terms of diversity of species and having lasted a long time, over 12,000, 14,000 years since the glaciers retreated. It's been a very stable, we could compare it to an ancient forest for us here. Instead, prairie is our forest. So there is a long history, a very long history of a different ecosystem out there than what we have left today.
Yeah, and people don't know it, but you know, a prairie has so many different species, both of plants and animals, but they're small, so you don't think about it. They aren't the classic megafauna.
Yeah, it's when it's hard when I've been very involved with prairie restoration my whole career and before actually, and planted a lot of prairie, and I think it's hard for us when we use that word prairie. It's a very confusing word to a lot of people because they think of just grass, but actually, you know, a prairie was millions of buffalo, millions of elk. I mean, we have all those fossils. I've been lucky to find those kind of fossils right in the riverbeds here in central Iowa. So, I mean, there was a lot of megafauna also, and a lot of dynamic all the way through the system in terms of even the organisms in the soil. If we could go down into that complexity of that, I mean, how many different kinds of organisms in a square foot of soil is probably beyond our comprehension.
Yeah, and you know, the prairie plants, most of the plant was underground.
Yes. Yes, and that's when they show pictures of the roots of the prairie grass, you know, it's 4 or 5 feet, 6, 10 feet sometimes at times down into the ground. So they were very adaptable out here on the plains because we have extreme weather, as we're seeing again here in Iowa, from very dry to very wet. And those kind of root systems were allowed for a real stability of that ecosystem.
And that's why the first settlers had trouble plowing it up because of all those roots until John Deere came up with the moldboard plow.
That's correct. That's right. Yeah, I just was listening to a thing this morning, and they were talking about the sound of that plow going through the prairie soil, sounding like a zipper opening it up, because once that was broken up and turned, it just couldn't go back to what it was almost. So.
Yeah. You know, the Iowa legislature back in the 1980s passed what's called the Resource Enhancement and Protection Act, or REAP. And the preamble to that statute, I've always saved it, and I think every public official in Iowa should have that on their desk or on their wall. And if I can just read a bit of it. The citizens of Iowa have built and sustained their society on Iowa's air, soils, waters, and rich diversity of life. The well-being and future of Iowa depend on these natural resources. Many human activities have endangered Iowa's natural resources. The state of Iowa has lost 99 9/10% of its prairies, 98% of its wetlands, 80% of its woodlands, 50% of its topsoils, and more than 100 species of wildlife since settlement in the early 1800s. There has been significant deterioration in the quality of Iowa's surface waters and groundwaters. The long-term effects of Iowa's natural resource losses are not completely known or understood, but detrimental effects are already apparent. Prevention of further loss is therefore imperative. The air, waters, soils, and biota of Iowa are interdependent and form a complex ecosystem. Iowans have the right to inherit this ecosystem in a sustainable condition without severe or irreparable damage caused by human activities. Doesn't that say it all?
Yes, it does. And it's interesting. I worked on that when it was first going to caucuses, trying to get that read and passed and put into planks, and moved up through the process. And it's ironic to me, I was extremely fortunate as a trails coordinator for Iowa because I got to go to almost every single state park, state preserve, recreation areas, and a lot of the fish and wildlife areas. So I was extremely fortunate, and in the process of getting to know those by walking on them face to face, I started doing analysis of kind of how much land we had and trying to find out more about the specific details of what you've said. And so the data that's come in and the information that we continue to gather since this even started, since we started, is just indicative of how things are continuing to move in the exact opposite of direction of what that was supposed to help accomplish. And that really is sad to me. That's extremely sad because the more we have the information to know things are going in the wrong direction, and now we're not talking about how to even go in the opposite direction, which is really sad.
So why do you think this happened?
Wow, that's a good one. I think there's I graduated as a sociologist and psychologist, and so I like looking at people. That's kind of my interest. And through my education within the DNR and everything, I realized that it wasn't the natural system that I was concerned with, it was the people. And so it has to do with how we relate to the world we live in, and how we could talk about politics and economics and all these dimensions of how we as people relate to the world we live in. But I think it goes deeper than that. I think there's a disconnect that has happened. And I think, referring back to when that plow went through and turned that prairie over, and you have to understand that transformation of that landscape happened so fast and so widespread that psychologically it was a hard adaptation for people to understand even. And I think I can illustrate that somewhat when I look at the map today, and I used to do these presentations where I'd hold up a piece of paper and I would say, let's talk about what's out there now. And so we would talk about the DNR owns and manages roughly about 1% of Iowa. And if we throw in all the public lands, the federal and things like that, we're getting up to about 2%, 2 to 3%. Well, that's not even covering the amount of ground that our roads cover. So if we throw in the cities and towns and we put all those together, we find out that agricultural has transformed about 93% of the state. And then about another 5 to 6% has been transformed into cities and roads. So now really in Iowa, we're only talking about about 1% having any kind of natural integrity left, so that we could even study or kind of look at to get some kind of idea of what we even lost out on. So one way, when you talked about 99.9% of the prairie being gone, and that being the dominant ecosystem here, what that boils down to is 30,000 acres of original prairie left out there, and that's counting all the little remnants, and that the majority of that's kind of over in the Luss Hills where it was too difficult to plow and for agriculture to transform that. But it's really frightening to me from a biological level what those figures mean, and figures don't mean a lot unless you can translate them into something. So I've tried to understand, if you have roughly 36 million acres here in Iowa, and you've transformed 2/3 of that, and it's continuing to expand from 62 to 63 to 64 to 65% of this state is now covered in 2 annual plants, corn and beans. And as you walk out into the cornfields, and which I like to do and everything, it's becoming difficult to even find bugs out there. It's just incomprehensible to me what a large area we're talking with so little biological diversity. So we've went from one of the richest biological diverse areas in the world down to the most biologically altered place in North America.
Now, some people would say, well, we have to feed the world. We have to have all this agricultural land.
And that's, we could talk about feeding the world because in one sense, we don't even really feed ourselves. 86% of everything we eat in this state is brought in from out of state, and it travels an average of 1,500 miles to get here. So when we talk about feeding the world, I don't think we need to talk about who we're going to blame, whether it's farmers or something. We've made the choice that we're going to do this with our state. But the state can't maintain itself biologically. And not only can the state not maintain itself biologically, it's now acting as a major roadblock to the flow of biological exchange taking place across the landscape. So when you look at our state compared to Minnesota, we think of timbers and lakes. And you look at Missouri and you think of timbers and these hills and valleys and all this rich diversity. And then you look at Iowa, things can't even move across the state. So if you would believe in global climate change, and they're talking about things having to adapt and keep moving north as things become warmer, Iowa is not going to allow that to happen for a lot of species. And it's already happened now. We have a lot of good data coming in saying the lesser scob duck, which is the most common diving duck in North America, cannot get across this state now without losing so much body weight that it can't reproduce, and actually bringing the numbers down. Their numbers are diving in numbers of ducks.
Is that because there's no place for it to land, to rest?
And water quality. The water quality has deteriorated so bad in Iowa that the very water that produces the food that they need to eat is not there. So they have no food source. So it's not even just that we're destroying the habitat and converting the habitat to an annual monoculture, but we also, the water quality. So it's all this whole array of species. So when you think of, we see all these dead animals on the edge of the road because they can't cross those major highways. Well, Iowa is the concrete between Missouri and Minnesota. And so things are dying on the sides of those roads, on the sides of Iowa, because they can't move along. And one good example of that would be the cougar here that was shot in Des Moines here just not too long ago, or the bobcats, or these things that they're hitting these roadblocks. They're trying to move up the landscape, and they're following these river valleys, the greenbelt, which are essentially the only thing really left in the state for these corridors, just like trails for us. And as they move along, they run into these blocks because there's no habitat to get them through these major cities. So their interface with people is even more.
A few years ago, my wife and I tried to get the cougar put on the endangered species list in Iowa, and the DNR refused to do it. The legislature refused to put it on the fur bearer list even, so it could be regulated. But the DNR's response was, well, there are no sustainable populations in Iowa. Well, no, because every time one comes in, it gets shot.
That's right. That's right.
We don't give it a chance to reproduce here. And usually the male comes in first to stake out a territory, and then the females come.
Yeah, that's right. And it's interesting to me. I mean, we finally have, this large animal that we're kind of have some fear of or something. And I find it really ironic because for me, the I've known a lot of people now getting Lyme's disease, and I think of the ticks as being our grizzly bears. They've replaced these things that we're afraid of, and why we don't have something with ticks. I mean, I know we're spraying a lot of poison and stuff trying to kill them, but it's still, I'd be afraid of ticks. I wouldn't be worried too much about a cougar.
Yeah. It seems to me that many people, if not most people, are afraid of nature. They look at it as being wild, and wild is something we don't want to deal with. We want something that we can control and feel safe around, rather than trying to live with nature.
Yeah, and that's right. I kind of try to turn things on their head sometimes to make the point. And so, if we're afraid of this wildness, but the wildness produces everything we need. I mean, without wildness, we have nothing. And so there's that level of it. But not only that, but, if you don't have wildness like in your stomach, if you don't have the organisms in your stomach to digest your food, you're not going to live either. And so now we're all moving towards these vitamins and probiotics to grow the right things in our stomach, because those organisms are even disappearing. So our health is getting directly affected both internally and externally from the loss of these species.
Yeah, and we think we can control nature, but the saying is nature bats last.
Yes, yeah. It's
you mentioned the state parks a while back, and we have some, but it seems to me that they really aren't about preserving the natural heritage. They're about being a resort almost.
That's correct. And I think, we can get back into some figures, and I'll try and give some definition to what those figures are. But, we think of state parks and how important they are. They came about, because we were changing the landscape so fast that Iowa realized that we had to save these last pieces that were left. Well, by the time we started our state park system in the early 1900s, 1920, by that point, all the area has been logged. A lot of it's been mined, clear-cut, grazed to no end. I mean, I have pictures of the Ledge State Park. There's not a tree on the slope. So what we think of as a natural landscape is by far, very far from an ancient forest kind of approach. It's completely a changed landscape. So if we look at those parks and we take them all together, now we in 1937, we led the nation in the establishment of state parks. It was extremely important to us because we had changed our landscape so fast to save those places. So, I think today we're up to, 57,000 acres. Okay, so what is 50,000 acres? All our state parks across the state, we all got some within about 80 miles of us at the farthest. And we put those all together in one place. We have a square roughly 9 miles on a side. And if you look inside that square and you put all the parks in there and you start taking out the roads and the parking lots and the park offices and the campgrounds and the sewage lagoons and the shelters and the picnic areas, and then we go in and open up the heart of that old healing landscape and put in a non-native bluegrass so that we can have picnic areas in there, and we change a lot of that habitat back to picnic area. So really that 9 miles on a side square, if you look at its biological integrity, is continuing to drop like a rock. I mean, the birds aren't there that I remember. The plant invasive species are just pouring into these landscapes, and there's no way that they can maintain their biological diversity. They're isolated. We have, 87? No, actually, there's 92 if we count all the state parks that are even managed by the county now, because we don't have the people to manage those parks. So if you look at all those, how break up that 9 mile square into 92 little pieces, and you separate them by 50 to 80 miles, you can see there's no biological integrity. There's no way that anything can move in or out of that to maintain that. So they're all dying. They're essentially, dying landscapes, and it's been hard for me to watch that.
Yeah. And every so often the DNR comes out with their outdoor recreation plan called SCORP.
Yes, I just...
The most recent one, it seemed like it was all about economic development.
Well, absolutely, and I think that's the saddest part of what we've come down to when we talk about the environment is that we're trying to figure out some way to sell the importance of it to people. We need a logo, we need a soundbite, we need, we've got to build a resort to get them there so we could educate them. It's all about, we talk about education but what that says to me is, there's something in our culture that's a total disconnect from where everything that we need to survive comes from. we have a total disconnect. And it comes from somewhere else. I mean, we can't even feed ourselves in this state. So I find it ironic that disconnect, because you don't sell, there's no way you can educate people into understanding the importance of this until it hits them in the face and they don't have something to eat or they don't have a drink of water. I mean, I think it's sad to see what motivates people to make change.
How would you motivate them?
I don't know. I'm. You don't do it by shaming. Evidently, I've been trying that. You don't do it by crying. I've been doing that for a long time. I don't. I think, I would hate to think that it's going to come down to Madison Avenue kind of approaches to convince people of the understanding of the importance of where everything comes from. And I hope that global climate change, the discussion, will at least lead us in that direction. But for me, what's even more important is that loss of biological diversity. We're looking at the lowest biological diversity in 65 million years. I mean, I don't think we can even begin to comprehend what this means. But on a physical level, to me, I'm out walking in the yard looking for lightning bugs. Where are the June bugs? Where are the butterflies? Where are the birds that I remember? They're not out there, and they're dropping like rocks. I mean, even the goldfinch, which is our state bird, we put it on our license plates, has declined 80% in the last 25 years. 90% of all bird species are declining in the last 10 years. And I've got pages and pages of statistics. We could go on and on and on about where things are moving, but they're not moving in a good direction.
Yeah. Over the last 4 billion years, species have come and gone, but at a much slower, much more sustainable rate to bring in new species. As you say now, it's just happening so quickly that it's just upsetting everything.
Yeah, the new one that hit me the other day, I was talking to a farmer, and he raises worms. Earthworms, and he realized that he couldn't raise earthworms on GMO crops, so he has to get organic corn stalks to raise earthworms on. And so he's saying, you can go out in the field and there's hardly any bugs or birds out or things out there, but a few, and when they show up in mass, and we try to go out and spray and kill them right away. That if you got one, you got a problem. So you've got these corn stalks that aren't even deteriorating now out in the landscape. So as we talk about no-till and everything, my questions move a little farther when I look down at the bottom of a slope and you see a barbed wire fence and there's 4 foot high of corn stalks sitting down there. And maybe they'll be easier to collect to make into biofuels or something. But at the same time, they're not deteriorating. The soil's leaving. We've lost half our topsoil in 50 years. I mean, there's not one indicator that I can look at and say, boy, this looks, there's some hope here. Yeah, I mean, even when we look at the bobcat, the growth in numbers, the cougars, the deer number explosions. I mean, when we look at things, we call those positive. I'm not sure that would be positive. That's more of a dramatic change taking place, of habitat change somewhere else, and these species are moving around trying to find a home. And so I did hear a nice story. It came through a Native American person, and he was saying, you're going to see this last tremendous flush of all these species at the end as things are dying off, because it's just like if you go out and you start overhunting coyotes, they start making more young. And just like people, I mean, think of, you've got people all over the world, what we consider poor, disadvantaged people. And what do? They have 10 and 12 kids, because there's something about how do you carry that on? And the species, I think that's what we're seeing in a lot of the species now, is this coming back, but it's a last effort to repopulate. So,
are the schools doing anything to help our children become more connected to nature?
It's funny, there's a great book out, Last Child Left in the Woods, and it's talking about nature deficit disorder, and it's kind of caused a real stir within the interpretation and the environmental education philosophy. And the major thing that it said, it's a book of just compiled totally of all these studies showing, what kids need is, you don't need to tell them rote about the names of trees and stuff. You need to get them out there in the mud, climbing a tree, playing in the creek. That's where you form those bonds and those experiences. It has nothing to do with the formal education thing. And it usually happened to most of us, especially people older like me when we were young. And when I was young, my father was in the military, so we moved around a lot. And, I have these vast memories of all these different places, of these little woods and creeks and everything. And one year I kind of did a pilgrimage, and I went back and traveled, took a summer and tried to travel and look at those. And I couldn't find one place left. I mean, there was not one place left. And I have a grandson now, and my greatest desire is to get him out there in that and have him have that experience. And all I got to do is get him out there and walk away and leave him alone and just stand at the top of the hill and make sure he's okay. And from there on, he's perfectly happy doing that.
Well, Mark, thanks a lot for being here. I appreciate it. It's been a great conversation.
Well, thank you, Wally. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and that's all the show for today. I want to thank, again, our sponsors, the Iowa Sierra Club, Physicians for Social Responsibility, the Great March for Climate Action, Gateway Market, Hawk Restaurant, and the Fighting Burrito. And thank you for joining us.
That's the fastest half hour.